The true origins of the ancient Egyptian civilization, India.
What we are about to watch is someone claim that the ancient Egyptians came from India, or that the Indian culture and the ancient Egyptian culture were equal in the past. This is not something that is a YouTube theory. Some people have speculated in the past that the land of Punt was actually referring to a place that's mentioned in the Rig Veda in India. Now, this is obviously not true, but let's see why.
The ancient upper and lower settlements along the River Nile were originally occupied by farmers, but later by a colony of kings and warriors who migrated from India.
Definitely not. First of all, let's address the farming thing. Yes, it was originally held by farmers in the early days, but farming was the main thing in Egypt up until what, the 1800s? So they weren't replaced by warriors. In fact, war in ancient Egypt does not really develop that much its entire time. I mean, if we look at the pictures of warriors that are depicted throughout the history, they really only start to get better in appearance when people like the Assyrians and then later the Greeks come. A lot of the warriors that are found in ancient Egypt at the time came actually from Nubia rather than Egypt, although these ones are pure Egyptians. But the other thing is, there is no evidence of warriors coming from any other place besides Egypt and Nubia by name. Remember, the ones that are called in ancient Egypt in the Nubian regions, they are given the name as Egyptians or Nubians. Now let's tackle the whole they moved from India thing. Well, not only is that not possible, but there are so many other groups in the middle of that how could they have possibly gotten there without anybody noticing? Without the Middle Easterners noticing, without the Sumerians noticing, and without themselves noticing because they didn't write about it.
According to the Mahabharata, they originally moved away because Lord Parashuram drove them out due to their warlike behaviour.
I'll say this again, the ancient Egyptians were not warlike. They did have wars and there was unifying of Egypt and the stopping of evil and all of that, but warlike is not a word that I would use to describe the ancient Egyptians. But of course, we have more important problems. One, the Mahabharata was not written earlier than the founding of ancient Egypt. There's probably 1,000 texts, more than 1,000, thousands of texts that predate the ancient Indian texts. We know that the Mahabharata is actually written in an Indo European script, which means that it is a fusion of a later religion. So it's not something that is as ancient as people pretend that it is. We don't even know how early ancient Indian writing is because the thing that we think is writing is only because of its symbolic consistency and it looks a bit like Sumerian. But of course, if we look at the ancient Egyptian writing, it looks nothing like that found in India.
This new habitat was originally known as Kemet, meaning a place with black fertile soil. Surplus crops was obviously a big attraction. In between India and the Nile was Mesopotamia, yet it was all part of the same world empire, connected by trade routes and cultural exchanges.
There's a lot of claims here that are being made with no evidence. So he's making the claim that Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India were all part of one giant group. Well, we know, I mean, if you've ever watched any of the documentaries about India, they came up with things that don't exist in ancient Egypt back in the day. Some if you don't believe me, go look at it. Go look at the ancient kingdoms in India. Yes, kingdoms. There was more than one in ancient India. There were a bunch of them actually. And then you look at the Mesopotamian kingdoms, another completely different story. Some of the stuff that they invented or created are just completely different. they traded with India. Mesopotamia 100% traded with India. We have a map where they documented India, but there's no evidence that the Mesopotamians were well aware of Egypt. Now, it's possible that they were, and yeah, it's possible. But a trade partner, all of that, that is still a hypothesis, and it's very difficult to explain, especially considering that these places grew so different from one another. Whereas if you compare later, when the Akkadians and the Assyrians and the Israelites and the later groups, they started to have more contact with each other. You start to notice stuff that invented in one place ends up in another quickly. Whereas here, I mean, like I said, the other video, camels were invented in one place and would only show up 4,000 years later in another place. This talks about some level of isolation.
And many kings recorded in ancient Sumerian, Egyptian, and Indian writings include similar names.
I'll give him one thing, he's very creative. So, obviously, if the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, and the Indians have very similar names, then that would be very, very, very good evidence that they belong to the same kingdom or expansion of kingdoms. So let's test the theory. Well, so first in the Sumerian we have Joshur, we have Kulish Yabal, we have Nangashilisma, and then, of course, we have a whole bunch of Sumerian names which sound nothing like names that you would find in other areas. Like, for example, in India, you have Birihadratha, Jarasandha, Sahadeva, Somadi, Shrudasrarav, Uyatayus. They sound very common to like what Indian names would sound like even later. Like there you have Dharma, Susma, Dridasena, Sumati, Subala, and later you'd have Ashoka, you'd have all these other people. Very similar. You'll notice that a lot of Indian names end with an A, which you won't find in almost any other place, really. But then you go to Egypt, it's like Narmer, Hor Ahar, Jet, Merinith, Dairy. Now, I know you don't pronounce these names like this, but even pronouncing them in any other. Let's take Narmer, for example. The first part of the name of Narmer is a catfish, which would be said as Nar, and that's why it's a catfish that's represented there. It's got nothing to do with an actual catfish. It has to do with how the names are presented, and then the scepter, which would be Mer. So it's Narmer. But if you compare that to almost any other word you will find in ancient Egypt, there's almost nothing that sounds similar, especially when you start going to names like Jet and Marineth and Hotep and stuff like that. Completely different culture. It would be easier to sell the idea that the ancient Indian words are more similar to the words found in the Sumerian areas. But of course, the Sumerians don't have as much interest as the ancient Egyptians are, which is why a lot of people want to tie their culture, no matter how far away it is, to the ancient Egyptians. And then they want to untie any other culture that, no matter how close it is, from the ancient Egyptians.
Along the Nile there emerged upper and lower kingdoms, but by 3100 BCE, the ruthless king Narmer from the upper invaded its rival and became the first pharaoh of a united Egypt.
That's actually the interesting thing about Narmer, that he was actually from Upper Egypt, which is where most people claim the Nubians would have been located at. And so, if you were to separate the ancient Egyptians as Nubians and Egyptians, even in this pre dynastic time, then you would say that the Nubians won against the other people, the other northerners. Now, Upper Egypt, I must emphasize, is in the lower part of Egypt today because the map was upside down.
Rama established the role as a godlike status. The country then entered an era of prosperity with expansion of arts, religion, and literature. It was a non-Vedic civilization that prospered at the outset of the Kali Yuga, and meanwhile, India declined. However, Egypt imported Indian culture, but with their own unique spin.
Everything was sort of making sense up until he started to say the important Indian culture with their own spin. First of all, that spinning thing that he showed there is a Sufi, which would be way after the death of the ancient Egyptian kingdom. But not only that, the culture of the ancient Egyptians, again, is nothing, and I'll say it again, nothing like that of the Indians. Just by looking at it, you can tell. The Indians, firstly, are, in my opinion, more colorfully dressed. Not in my opinion, factually, they're better colorfully dressed. The ancient Egyptians seem to just dress in white compared to everybody else, really, in history.
Amongst the architectural achievements were, of course, the pyramids. They were not
While there are stuff in India later that exists that you could consider pyramids, the use and the reality of them in the ancient world is so vastly different in Egypt. And then, of course, the size. Nothing really from anywhere in the world compares to the size of the pyramids in ancient Egypt. It's just too unique to themselves. Not to mention that we know exactly how they were built, we know their history, and their history has nothing to do with India. In fact, their history has something to do with Sudan.
originally built just as tombs, but state sponsored portals to the next life. The philosophy included the soul, its transmigration, and communion with the divine. The first step pyramid is a tribute to Imhotep, who was an all round genius. Imhotep means he who comes in peace, so that's evidence he may have come from abroad. But most
He who comes in peace means he comes from abroad. Also, the fact that that step pyramid was made in Egypt and not made anywhere near India is, I wonder if he's going to address that. But let's first address the whole thing about the step pyramid and blah blah blah. The step pyramid is a bunch of mastabas built on top of each other. This person was genius in his building of this step pyramid, but the genius that would come after him is something else. The people who would build pyramids smooth all the way to the top, that was something else. But then also, if these people came from India, why do you need these people to? Why would Imhotep? Why would it matter that he's foreign if all of them came from India anyway?
convincing are the clear Vaishnav Hindu tilaks on his body in this particular drawing.
That is interesting. Until, of course, you realize that that drawing is based on this statue of Imhotep, which means he who comes in peace. But there's a couple problems. One, this drawing is not of the statue is not of the same Imhotep who made the step pyramid. This is a completely different Imhotep. And then secondly, this Imhotep does not have those T-laxes, is what he called them, on the body. He's got actually pretty smooth skin with no dents on the body. It's actually very unlikely to find any dents on the body's tattoos and the like on ancient Egyptian anything. So again, he drew those things on, but it doesn't even matter because that drawing has got nothing to do with ancient Egypt.
The original layers of limestone in pyramids that followed concealed the structure's core and gave it its surface a smooth finish, gleaming in the sunlight. Excavations of a pyramid dated 3000 BCE revealed an engraved verse about reincarnation from the Bhagavad Gita.
Now I know you guys will probably figure out that this is absolutely not true because of a couple reasons. One, there is no way in hell that the Bhagavad Gita would be in ancient Egypt and the only person who found out was some YouTuber. And then secondly, What?
Chapter 2, verse 22. Some say the pyramids originally represented the Vedic Mount Meru, a Maha Meru.
You just gave us the real person who invented the step pyramid, which would lead to the other pyramids. So clearly they don't represent Mount Meru.
This is similar to the dome-shaped temples of South India.
I don't want to pick on small things, but I gotta say it. He said this is similar to the dome shaped temple. This is a pyramid shaped temple, not a dome shaped. And sure, but this temple was built when? And then, secondly, it's nothing like the pyramid because the pyramid doesn't cut off, it's straight to the top. And then, not to mention that you probably meant the dome topped pyramid because it's got a dome right at the top. This is very consistent with other Indian architecture, but has nothing to do with Egyptian.
Note that in the Indian Vastu Shastra, pyramids are believed to nullify negativity. It seems the pharaohs began to use them for more selfish purposes, to nullify any bad karma.
So obviously, you guys will know that there is no such thing as karma in ancient Egypt, and there's no such thing. While I'm at it, there's no such thing as dharma or any of the other concepts that are found in India, which you would think if they came from the same place, they would have some of those similar concepts. The pyramid is a long story about why it is as it is.
The Great Pyramids of Giza's southern shaft in the King's Chamber pointed directly to the stars on Orion's belt. The purpose was to allow the deceased pharaoh and his servants to reach Osiris. A major purpose was to send people to planets of the kingly forefathers, Pityaloka.
Well, while that is a very interesting theory, allow me to rebuttal. uh, the ancient Egyptian underworld and the ancient Egyptian next world and the ancient Egyptian ancestral worship had nothing to do with any of what he just talked about. And Pictaloka has got nothing to do with the ancient Egyptians. And if he did, his name would be all over the tombs. Instead, Seth is probably the most mentioned to do with the burying of the dead, who he is also associated with the underworld. And of course, you have Apep and you have all these other creatures who not only do they not look like anything in ancient Egypt, but the only god in Egypt that sort of has a similarity to the ancient Egyptian ones is Ganesha because he's got the head of an elephant.
But the obsession of preserving and mummifying physical bodies was surely due to material attachments.
Interestingly, he points out something that would debunk what he's saying, even though I won't use it as a point because, first of all the kings of India were very materially attached as well.
Anyway, then there's the Sphinx. Sphinxes were ancient symbols of the progress of human existence and temple guardians. Now consider these. In the Hingol National Park in present-day Pakistan, just west of the Indus Valley. Now these are not natural rock formations and are dated around 10,000 BCE. The Sphinxes of the Sri Shiva Nataraj Temple in Chidambaram. A carving of the Varadaraj Perumal Temple in Tribhuvanai.
If we exclude the natural rock formation that he showed and said it wasn't a natural rock formation, we have the sphinxes that he shows. Now, those sphinxes are pretty amazing and they're pretty close to what a lot of these other animals are, but that can simply be a later thing because, of course, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Akkadians, so many other people used a lion body with a head of a human being. Now, the Sphinx is a little different, but let's not get into the details of that. But, you know, that could have been an Egyptian inspiration later on. But it's not, it's not the same as the earlier things that came about. in the Indus Valley civilizations and even the early later civilizations in India.
Egyptians, according to their own records, originated from the sacred land of Punt, the home of their gods. Punt or Panth referred to a holy land with Pandids.
The ancient Egyptians never claimed to originate from Punt. They actually claimed to originate and even consider the Holy Lands the Nubian regions, which was mainly in Upper Egypt and Sudan, but Punt was a faraway land very distant from where they were. And secondly, it's got nothing to do with India. It's actually in East Africa. And that has been tested many, many times. And it's pretty much known now that it's somewhere in East Africa, nowhere near India. Now, there are there words that are similar to Punt in India? Yes, but there's a lot of words similar to Punt everywhere around the world, even in Europe.
India as their ancestral home is supported by the finding of human DNA in North Kerala, similar to that of some of those in ancient Egypt.
Interestingly, I've looked at the DNA of ancient Egyptians and I've looked at the DNA of ancient Indians, and by claim of the ancient, well, of the scholars of both kingdoms, they have nothing to do with each other. In fact, not only are they so distant from each other, but the Indian DNA also has nothing to do with some of the people who are very close to India as well, including people like the Chinese and stuff like that. And some of the Andamanese people only have a very minor play in the DNA of some of the kingdoms in ancient India. So to say that the Egyptians who live so far away have the DNA of the Indians is a wild claim and should not be skimmed over if you have proof.
Now let's look at some of their gods. Amun was depicted with blue skin and having feathers in his crown. He is often described as a symbol for creative force and the most powerful of the gods.
While Amun could be depicted in blue, he was mainly depicted in black or green, and sometimes, in a very rare case, blue, and then flesh colors, so a human flesh color. This was because he was a normal, human being, well, normal in a sense in his depiction. And if you notice, unlike a lot of the other ones, he's not very mixed with animals or anything like that. But if we look at the feather, you can see there that he added some Photoshop feather thing. I don't know why. And you'll also notice that these two people have nothing in common. Amun and I'm guessing that's Krishna. Their clothes don't even look the same, which is one of the big things that I was talking about earlier, that their culture is so vastly different. Where's the symbol of the Ankh in India?
Like Lord Krishna. Amunit is the consort of Amun, and they were both said to be existing before creation. This makes her similar to Krishna's consort Radharani. Mut
Now, this is the part where I won't completely disagree with him, that some of the gods of India, which a lot of them were added later and changed later, have some similarities with ancient Egyptian gods. Now, a lot of these are coincidence based, but he's drawing them together. Now, of course, he drew a tiger in the other one. There were no tigers in ancient Egypt, so there is no similarity there at all.
is described as queen of the goddesses, mother, and she who gives birth, like Durga. Khonsu's complexion is white, like the moon. He carries a heka, which represents a plough, like Lord Balaram.
The only thing this video is inspiring me to do is to go and look up those gods, because I used to be very interested in them when I was a little kid. In Indra, in Ganesha, in Hanuman, in Ramayana. There was a cartoon about Ramayana which I loved when I was younger. But these gods are very interesting in India. They don't need to have an extra Egyptian tie. There's no need for that. In fact, that cheapens them, in my opinion, because I mean, I hate to. I know I like Africa, but the stories are so intricate about how Ganesha, ran a race against someone around the world, and instead of running, he just studied about the world and then claimed that that made him wise because he explored the world without traveling it, which is would be a way deeper message today now that we have the internet. You know, you don't need to go around the world to know about the world, although it's better to go.
Amun, Mut, and Khonsu are sometimes worshipped as a triad, similar to Jagannath, Baldev, and Subhadra, or others say like Sita, Ram, and Lakshman.
Others say that they're like Sita, Lakshmi, and what? Who are these others and where are they located? Because they're lying to you. Nobody has ever compared these two people, those three, the same. And the triad thing, that's a stretch.
The Egyptian god Ptah is from the Sanskrit Pitta, meaning father, a reference to God the Father as creator, like Lord Brahma. Nefertum was the god of each morning's creation of day, associated with the lotus flower, very similar to Lord Brahma, who sits upon a lotus flower, and each of his days is a new creation. Adashtalha is directly another name for Lord Shiva, but Atum seems to have more in common with Shiva because he is associated with snakes and has a human head. Nun or Nu, who with blue skin raised the gods from the primordial waters, is similar to Garbhadakshai Vishnu, and images of him raising a boat is similar to Vishnu in the form of Matsya. Sheshat, the goddess of writing, music, and astrology, like Sarasvati. Kunem, with the head of a ram, is said to have fathered many gods, like the Hindu Manu, Daksha. Babi or Baba was the monkey god, the chief of the monkeys or baboons, similar to Hanuman, although with much less self-control. Apedimak, like Nishingadev. Like the Hindus, the Egyptians were also conceived the four corners of the earth as a cow. Now, like the Vedic Hindu priests, Egyptian priests would shave their heads and wear white cloth, chant prayers, burn incense, took care of deities, performed rituals on boats on the Nile, like the role of the Ganges. Like in India, Egyptian scribes and teachers had seekers. The Opet festival, similar to Rath Yatra. Pharaoh's crowns were decorated with the symbol of a cobra as a sign of respect and the power of the Kundalini within. Ramesses was potentially titled after the ideal ruler, Lord Ram of the Sun dynasty. The specific meaning is begotten by the sun god, Ra. Now, the name of the river Nile comes from the Sanskrit Nil, meaning blue. The irrigation methods of ancient Egypt were similar to those that were practiced across India. And the final example. Note this image of a 19th dynasty emperor of northern Egypt. Hey, he's wearing tilak marks. Thanks for watching, and please share with others.
The part about the gods was actually interesting from a entertainment point of view. I do believe that the ancient Egyptians did have some push to India for the later gods to change in some way, especially with the addition of the halos and stuff like that. But I don't believe that the origin are exactly the same. Sure, they loved the same plants like the lotus and stuff like that, but to me that means nothing. There's a reason why I didn't disturb that part because I actually think it's interesting on its own. I like stuff like that where people draw similarities between religions, and the reason why it's no point of arguing with it is because religion to me is not something that needs to be argued from a factual point of view. In conclusion, India and Africa are two completely different continents, subcontinent in the case of India, and they have two completely different histories and reasons why they did what they did. They did worship some of the similar animals like cattle and stuff like that in very different ways. But, you know, it's respectable, and I respect the fact that he made this and tried to draw the similarities together because I think alternative ideas like this should be explored, though not taken as seriously as other ideas.